Senior White House correspondent Peter Doocy reporting live from the White House. Peter, very interesting precursor to the big meeting. It went on quite a long time, and a lot was aired out before they went behind closed doors.
Yes, very interesting. They are still behind closed doors in the cabinet room having lunch at the long table that is in there. The U.S. delegation is on one side, the Ukrainian delegation is on the other. And when we were in there, President Trump referred to himself. He gave himself a new title, the mediator president. And right there on live TV, we learned that President Zelenskyy isn't just here right now asking for Tomahawk missiles to strike deep inside Russia. He is offering a trade, basically. Tomahawk missiles for Ukrainian drones.
The United States has Tomahawks and other missiles, very strong missiles, but they can have our thousands of drones.
President Trump, I don't mean to be brokering an arms deal here, but is that something that you would be interested in, Ukrainian drones?
We are, yeah, or we would.
Some new info about the upcoming meeting with President Trump and President Putin. For the time being, it doesn't sound like Zelenskyy is going to be directly involved. Too much bad blood, according to President Trump. But despite that, he thinks this war may be nearing a beginning of the end, to the point that maybe the talk about new missiles to the battlefield can end here.
It's not easy for us to give. You're talking about massive numbers of very powerful weapons. So that's one of the things we'll be talking about. Hopefully they won't need it. Hopefully we'll be able to get the war over with without thinking about tomahawks. I think we're fairly close to that.
And we can guess, that's all we can do about whether or not a relatively short meeting as far as these things go is a good sign for Tomahawks to Ukraine or a bad sign. But you can see down at the end of this driveway, President Zelenskyy's armored SUV has pulled up to the West Wing lobby, waiting to take him off to his next stop, that press conference. Martha.
Yeah, we'll see if this was a relatively brief lunch after a relatively lengthy open news conference in that cabinet room. Peter, thank you very much. We'll bring in retired four-star general Jack Keane, Fox News senior strategic analyst and former vice chief of staff of the Army and chairman of the Institute for the Study of War. General, always great to have you with us. Obviously, this is a big moment for President Zelenskyy. He has been pressing for Tomahawks. It sounds like that is not going to happen until after something further is ironed out with President Putin. What's your take so far, General?
Yeah, well, I think something must have happened in that 2.5-hour conversation that President Trump had with President Putin that gave him, once again, some optimism here that we could really make a deal. To date, I mean, Putin's strategy has never changed, and that is to take control of Ukraine and expand into Europe. And he's shown some evidence of that. And he uses stalling, in my mind, to protract the war, Martha, because he believes that time is on his side. Mm-hmm. Because eventually the United States resolve will be weakened, and so will the Europeans. And he thinks then the advantage would swing to him. And for those out there who read the narrative that Putin creates and finds its way into the media and other places inside the United States, Putin is not winning this war. Quite the contrary. I mean, he started another offensive last year, and he's hardly made any progress whatsoever. And he wanted to take all of southern Ukraine was the objective. He hasn't even come close to it. And that's why at the last conference that they had, he was asking for territory that Ukraine was in occupation of. And we look at that at the Institute for Study of War, and we don't see him taking that territory at all. He doesn't have the capability to do that. But he does have this. He believes if he protracts the war, the casualties continue to mount. The pressure is on Zelenskyy, and also the pressure is on President Trump, to work some kind of a deal and hopefully make some concessions. And during this whole time, Martha, which is really quite striking, Putin has done what? He's escalated the war. Mm-hmm. He has conducted massive operations against the Ukrainian population and their energy sector, largely with swarming drones manufactured in one major center, the Abaluga Manufacturing Center, that was started by the Iranians. They've got about 20,000 North Koreans who are building these Shahed drones. and they are formidable, to say the least, and out of range of any offensive weapon that's in the control of the Ukrainians. Thus, enter the Tomahawk weapons here. And that's the reality of what we're dealing with, is that Putin wants to protract the war, increase the pressure on the other parties. And when it comes down to, what is President Trump trying to accomplish? End of war. That's his motivation here, just as it was in the Middle East and others. What is Zelensky's motivation? He wants to go to a ceasefire and a deal that's fair. And he's ready to do that today. He was ready to do it at the Alaska summit. He was ready to do that months prior to that. So what's the holdup? It's Putin. Mm-hmm. He doesn't want to go to a ceasefire, and he doesn't want to accept any of the terms presented to him right now that would lead to eventually some kind of end-of-war deal. Why? For the reason I stated. He actually believes that if he continues the war and wears all the other parties down, it's in his interest, despite the military challenges facing, despite the increase in economic challenges that he's facing. And after all, he thought sanctions were coming prior to this, and they did not happen. And now he sees possibly long-range weapons that can take out the major manufacturing center. And Martha, all the bombs that they're using to fly cruise missiles, the same kind of cruise missiles that Tomahawk is, into those Ukrainian cities, and they also use glide bombs coming out of those bombers as well as the cruise missiles. Those would be the primary targets. So when people are talking about, well, this is such a significant escalation, if you look at it militarily, what is Zelenskyy really trying to do? He's trying to use Tomahawk long-range missiles to protect his population centers and protect his energy centers from the Shahed drones, the source of them, and from the bombers that are delivering those cruise missiles, the ballistic missiles, and the like. So that's what this is about, and hopefully a deal is being made here. I mean, one option you could do is you say, I'll give you the Tomahawk missiles, President Zelenskyy, and you can use them if Putin doesn't come to the table and make a good deal with us in 2 weeks. That's an option. He has an appeal to both sides. Zelenskyy, you're going to get the weapons, but I got a condition. Putin, here's the condition. Let's make a deal.
Yeah. Zelenskyy has suggested that. He has said, we might not even have to use them. He seems to want them as a deterrent as they get, as they begin these negotiations. We're going to take a quick break. We're waiting to see if Zelenskyy exits the door there. General Keane is going to stay with us, and we're grateful for that.
All right, let's bring back in our reporter panel, Trey Yanks, Jackie Heinrich, Benjamin Hall, and Steve Harrigan. And Trey, let's start with you. Because this idea of whether or not are going to be negotiations in the near future, I think really hinges to a great degree on what Marco Rubio and Sergei Lavrov talk about in Budapest next week. But the President Trump, also was asked whether there might be a trilateral meeting. And he sort of thought about it for a second, and he almost seemed to suggest that he would like to see a scenario where when he finally meets with Putin in Budapest, that maybe Zelenskyy is in the city as well, and could either be brought in for a trilat or maybe separate bilateral meetings with Trump as the go-between. What do you think?
Yeah, John, absolutely. President Trump said he thinks there's a good chance that a deal could be reached. But my take on the conversation there in the White House is pretty clear. President Trump is negotiating in real time. That's why he was holding his cards so close to the chest on the question of Tomahawks, because by giving them to Ukraine right away with no discussion, it takes negotiation off the table with Russian President Putin. Now, Zelenskyy realized that in real time and immediately shifted the conversation in that press conference to talking about security guarantees, things that have been discussed in Europe for the past several months. Article 5-like guarantees for Ukraine that could be supported by the United States to give the Ukrainians incentive to reach an agreement, even if it means giving up some of their territory. We should also talk about what Martha mentioned here when it comes to the idea that this could lead to escalation if ultimately Tomahawk missiles are provided. And you all raised a very important point earlier about the Russians. I remember back in November of last year, I was traveling on a train from eastern Ukraine to Kyiv with the President Zelenskyy, And hours later, he made the decision to fire U.S.-supplied ATACMS into Russia. And at the time, the Kremlin said if that happened, it would spiral tension with Washington and Moscow. Ultimately, that didn't happen. And so largely, both the Ukrainians and the Americans see the Russians as the boy who cried wolf. They say that decisions will be made and they will lead to an increase in tension. And while certainly this would be an escalation, a step up on the escalation ladder, the Russians in the past, whether it was the Javelin missiles in the early days of the war, the HIMARS, the ATACMS, the U.S.-supplied artillery units that went to the eastern part of the country, each and every moment these weapon systems were supplied, the Russians said there would be an escalation. And so the reality is the escalation started in February of 2022 when the Russians invaded a sovereign country in Eastern Europe. Now we're talking about the possibility of a negotiated settlement. And like I said, it appears that President Trump is trying to negotiate in real time, understanding that he had a 2.5-hour phone call with Russian President Putin yesterday. He's about to have a very extensive meeting with Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelenskyy. And then there is that summit that's going to take place at a ministerial level next week with Secretary of State Rubio to lay the foundation for that high-stakes meeting between President Trump and Russian President Putin.
Okay, Benjamin Hall, your reaction to what you just heard.
You know, I think President Zelenskyy was not entirely comfortable in that meeting, and I think he must be asking what more can he do. You know, he was very clear today. He said, we would do a ceasefire tomorrow. I would sit down with Putin and talk with him tomorrow. He's incredibly grateful for all of the weaponry that the US has been giving him. And in fact, just yesterday, he met both with Raytheon and with Lockheed Martin. So President Zelenskyy has been on the same page for quite some time. And the big question is, when will Putin come to the table and actually make some serious negotiations? And one of the most interesting parts I thought of that whole meeting is when President Trump was asked, do you think President Putin is just trying to buy a little bit more time from you? And President Trump said, yes, maybe he is. I've played all my life by the best of them, but I'll get there in the end. So fascinating to hear that. And I think President Zelenskyy is just trying to figure out what more he can do. He's saying all the right things. From that very first press conference that we saw in the White House on their first meeting many months ago to this, President Zelenskyy is saying all the right things. He acknowledges the momentum that they have from the peace deals in Gaza and the Middle East, and he's saying this is your moment. But there's very little more that President Zelenskyy can give, except perhaps the land that President Putin wants, that critical part of Donbass, which the Russians have been trying to get since 2014. And I just think that President Zelenskyy is ready to meet. He's ready to do a ceasefire deal, and it is for President Putin, or rather President Trump, to persuade President Putin to meet and to match that.
Steve Harrigan, there was an interesting moment there when our Peter Doocy seemed to play the part of Fox News' Adnan Khashoggi and was brokering an arms deal between Ukraine and the president, where Zelenskyy said, look, you give us Tomahawks, we'll let you have thousands and thousands of drones. Ukraine certainly has been putting together a lot of sophisticated, very small drones and employing them to great effect in the battlefield. President Trump didn't seem too interested in that deal when Steve Doocy asked him about it. So, to Benji's point, what more can Ukraine do? To Benji's point, what more can Ukraine do in order to try to get what it wants from President Trump?
I think there were some missed opportunities by Zelenskyy, and I think Trey's right to point out that he did seem a little uncomfortable at many points in that meeting. He missed an opportunity when talked to compare Biden and Trump. But overall, I think what really struck me was the man who wasn't in the room, Vladimir Putin, and what President Trump had to say about Putin. In the past, Trump has been very transparent about dealing with Vladimir Putin. He's expressed puzzlement. He's expressed frustration, even anger at times. This wasn't that today. After the 2.5-hour conversation yesterday, Trump really seemed to project confidence that for the first time, Putin wants to end this war. He didn't give any reasons, but I think that sense of confidence from a man just coming off a big victory in the Middle East really gives hope that there might be some movement on Putin's part.
All right. Thank you for that. Jackie, leave us off with the thought here as they are now inside with the cameras off and the reporters having left the room, where the afternoon goes and, if these two will work anything out.
Yeah, speaking to Benji's point and Steve Harrigan's point, I think it is interesting that President Trump seems confident that Putin wants to end the war. But when he was asked why he thinks that is, what's bringing him to the table now, he wasn't able to answer that question. Said that he doesn't really know what's bringing Putin to the table now, although he feels confident about, where Putin's at right now. And there are some avenues where Zelenskyy can take that, even if it doesn't involve tomahawks, because the president gave this sort of appearance of maybe not being willing to go there right now. But the sanctions package is another strong tool that Zelenskyy has been asking for, and President Trump has been dangling for a long time. The threat of huge secondary sanctions on major purchasers of Russian oil, China and India. You have that 25% tariff that the president has threatened, and the promise from Modi to the president this week that they would no longer be buying Russian oil soon. But you also have in Congress 85 votes ready in the Senate the minute that the president gives the green light. And so perhaps that is another tool that Zelenskyy will look to for the rest of the conversation today if it looks like he's going to hit a dead end with the Tomahawk discussion.
See where all of this goes. Of course, I've been Peter Doocy, not Steve Doocy. Small senior moment there. Jackie, Steve, Benji, Trey, thanks for joining us. Really appreciate it.
Thank you all.
President Trump, you're the middleman right now, hoping to end this conflict. Who is doing a better job negotiating, President Zelenskyy or President Putin?
I think they're both doing a great job in that sense. We have to get it done. We've got to take some of the hatred of each other. They don't like each other. I say that in front of President Zelenskyy, but I say it in front of President Putin too. They have tremendous bad blood. It really is what is holding up, I think, a settlement. I think we're going to get it done, and we have to make it long-lasting. As I said in the Middle East, everlasting, right? Everlasting. And the Middle East is a much more complicated situation. We had 59 countries involved, and every one of them agreed. And it's sort of amazing. Most people didn't think that was doable. This is going to be something I really believe that's going to get done. I had a very good talk yesterday with President Putin. I think he wants to get it done.
All right, let's bring in Dan Hoffman now, former Moscow CIA station chief and Fox News contributor, and Rebecca Grant, national military and security analyst. Dan, your takeaway from what we just heard from the White House as this critical meeting goes on?
Yeah, I think that President Trump wants to solve this one without providing Ukraine the military assistance that Ukraine has been asking for, without giving them the tomahawks. I think he'd like to use that as leverage to try to get Putin to the negotiating table. The challenge is that I don't see any evidence that Putin wants to end the war. I think his objective has always been to overthrow the democratically elected government of Ukraine and take over the country. And I don't think there's any indication Putin has wavered from that. Putin has a high threshold for pain when it comes to putting his own people and North Koreans through the meat grinder of the most destructive land war in Europe since the Second World War, as well as the impact on his economy of all the sanctions and the fact that he's had to swivel to China for exporting his hydrocarbons and importing dual-use military equipment.
So, Rebecca, try to get us inside Putin's head here. President Trump starts talking about Tomahawk missiles. All of a sudden, Putin's on the phone to Trump. This was at the Kremlin's request, this phone call yesterday. Suddenly, they're talking about a ministerial meeting in Budapest next week between Rubio and Lavrov. And then they're talking about a principals meeting between President Trump and Putin at some point down the road in the same city. Is Putin worried here, or is he just trying to play for time, as was suggested?
Because inside Putin's head, here's what you're hearing: tomahawks, tomahawks, tomahawks. The tomahawk can be in Ukraine in 24 hours. The launcher and the missiles fit in a C-17. So Trump doesn't have to decide. He just has to continue to mention it occasionally. And as Putin knows, that puts 60 Russian air bases in range and a lot of the gas and oil infrastructure. And Trump mentioned escalation. He said, yeah, it's an escalation, but we're still going to talk about it. So I think some very pointed messages directly to Putin that Trump is very supportive of Ukraine and willing to do what it takes to get Putin to the table.
All right, Rebecca, Dan, appreciate you joining us on the breaking news. Thank you both.
Thank you.
Thanks, folks.
Big day at the White House as President Trump gets ready to welcome Ukrainian President Zelenskyy. Yesterday, the president announced he will hold a second summit in the coming weeks with Russian President Putin in Budapest, Hungary. He said they have had a productive phone call in the last 24 hours, but he's been very public, the president has, about his trust issues with Putin.
We get a lot of bullshit thrown at us by Putin, for you want to know the truth. He's very nice all the time, but it turns out to be meaningless.
Putin really surprised a lot of people. He talks nice and then he bombs everybody in the evening. So there's a little bit of a problem there, and I don't like it.
Senior White House correspondent Peter Doocy is on the North Lawn. Peter.
Harris, President Trump is putting out the word ahead of this meeting with Zelenskyy that even though his most recent battlefield assessment is that Ukraine can fight and win back all of the territory that Russia has taken and currently occupies over the course of this 3-year war, at the moment he is still going to play both sides when it comes to Tomahawk cruise missiles.
But did President Putin try to dissuade you from selling Tomahawk missiles?
Well, of course. What do you think he's going to say? Please sell Tomahawks? Is he going to say, please sell those Tomahawks? I really appreciate it. I did actually say, would you mind if I gave a couple of thousand Tomahawks to your opposition? I did say that to him. I said it just that way. He didn't like the idea. He really didn't like the idea. No, I said it that way. You have to be a little bit lighthearted sometimes, but no, he doesn't want Tomahawk is a vicious weapon.
Zelenskyy posted ahead of today's meeting, we have already prepared our part of the homework ahead of the meeting with President Trump, both the military component and the economic one. And after this meeting, the next step is going to be a meeting of top diplomats before a Trump-Putin-Zelenskyy summit.
I think it's helpful that Rubio and Lavrov are going to meet first next week. And certainly if Lavrov isn't putting something real on the table there, I don't think we should get the president involved in another meeting that leads to empty promises.
And President Trump was disappointed in Vladimir Putin after they met in Alaska at the end of the summer. So something must have changed in Putin's tone or in Putin's pitch to make the president want to accept this second meeting in Hungary. Harris?
All right, Peter, thank you. In focus now, Brett Velikovich, Fox News contributor and former U.S. Army intelligence and special operations soldier. Brett, you've spent some critical time on the ground during the early and middle parts of the war in Ukraine, so you've gotten to see that perspective. What do you think of a second summit now? First of all, let's start with Zelenskyy at the White House. Get your reaction on that.
Well, you know, Harris, what we're watching right now, I think, is classic President Trump diplomacy. He's about to welcome Zelenskyy to the White House just days after announcing another summit with Vladimir Putin in Budapest. And that's not coincidence, that's strategy. Trump's the only person on the planet who can get Putin on the phone one day and Zelenskyy at the White House the next. And that's called leverage. And that's how you move the world. That helps continue to reassert America's role as the world's negotiator, not the world's ATM machine with blank checks for endless wars. And so people can call it unconventional diplomacy, but I call it pressure point diplomacy. You don't end wars with hashtags and headlines, you end them with leverage, real outcomes, and leadership. And Putin the other day, he called the 2-hour conversation with the president productive, and he can do that all he wants. But the truth is simple. As long as Russian missiles and drones keep striking Ukrainian civilians, talk from him is just noise. He talks like a statesman, but then acts like a warlord. And I think Trump finally knows the difference. He finally understands how Putin thinks. He's seen how to use strength to force movement. And that's really what this recent announcement of this potential sending Tomahawk missiles has done. Putin may not respect many leaders, but he respects leverage. And Russia's recent public warning about the Tomahawk shows just how nervous they are about Trump's leadership. And that's exactly how you bring Russia to the table without even firing a shot. You let them know that the cost of continuing this war is only going to go up. That's the same playbook that brought peace in the Middle East: strength, clarity, respect. And if peace can happen in the Middle East, it can happen in Ukraine.
Look, that's a great example of the Tomahawks being used inside Syria when Bashar al-Assad had used chemical weapons on his own people. And look at where we are now. We're in much better diplomatic relations with Syria, trying to help them get sanctions relief under new leadership. It is fascinating what can happen if you send in Tomahawk missiles and you mean it. You don't just threaten it, you do it. Iran, another example of that. So, as you say, we've got some leverage, certainly leverage with our military. What else works as you get ready to potentially see a second summit with Putin and President Trump?
Well, it's got to be strength. I mean, diplomacy without strength is just wishful thinking. So I'm really hoping that this isn't just about being friendly with Putin when the president speaks with him. It's about being effective with him. You don't make peace with your friends, you make it with your enemies. And that's what Trump understands. You know, for years, people in Washington, they talked about process, but Trump doesn't care about process. He cares about outcomes. And the outcome we're looking for here is ending this war without draining America's arsenal or dragging us into an endless conflict. And nobody says that's going to be solved overnight. And so I think what success looks like coming out of this week, this week is Putin realizes his free pass has expired. Zelenskyy leaves Washington knowing America's backing him smartly, but not blindly. And then the rest of the world sees American president using strength as a tool for peace and not just as a threat.
Do you see us using those Tomahawk missiles? Do you? I mean, you've watched it. You've watched the incoming from Russia into Ukraine. What is really necessary, real quick?
I think what's necessary is upping the cost for Russia and sending Ukraine weapons that can potentially reach Moscow. That is scary to Putin. That's scary to his base. And so that's the only thing that's going to get him to really come to the peace table.
Brett Velikovich, great to have you in focus. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
So happening today, President Trump will host Ukrainian President Zelenskyy as he considers whether to give the country Tomahawk missiles ahead of his meeting with Russian President Vladimir Putin.
We need Tomahawks for the United States of America, too. We have a lot of them, but we need them. I mean, we can't deplete for our country. So, you know, they're very vital. They're very powerful.
Here to discuss it is retired four-star general, Fox News senior strategic analyst, chairman of the Institute of Study of War, which is a must-read every day, General Jack Keane. General, your thoughts about the Vladimir Putin's timing on the call and Zelenskyy's meeting today?
Well, certainly I think probably the president heard something in that call. What we don't know is he's had so much conversation with Putin. Is there something different in terms of his sincerity this time about really wanting to make some kind of compromise? Obviously, it's worth the president's time in his mind that he expects something like that to happen. The evidence we have to date, and certainly the president is very much aware of it, that Putin has made continuous promises and hasn't kept them. And indeed, since all of these talks have been going on the phone and certainly in person as well, what has Putin done? He's escalated the war against civilians, and he expanded military incursion into NATO countries. That's the reality of what we're dealing with, and no evidence whatsoever of compromise. I think it's helpful that Rubio and Lavrov are going to meet first next week. And certainly if Lavrov isn't putting something real on the table there, I don't think we should get the president involved in another meeting that leads to empty promises. But look, the president knows how to leverage an adversary. He's just demonstrated that clearly in the Middle East. The facts speak for themselves. So he understands that. And also the other thing we should know is, look, the Russian army wasn't good when the war began. It's not good now, and it's never going to be good. They are extraordinarily vulnerable. They've just had an offensive. They've been trying to succeed in taking the southern part of Ukraine for over a year, and they have failed at doing it. They actually wanted, if you remember, Zelenskyy to give up the territory they cannot take. And we at the Institute for the Study of War don't think they can ever take it. So that's what Putin is facing. And now, you know, with the possibility of Tomahawks reaching the sanctuary that protect the bombers that are delivering cruise missiles on the civilian population, and also touching the manufacturing capability of where the Shahed drones are being manufactured, that sanctuary is protected because Ukraine doesn't have the long-range weapons to reach it. That's what the Tomahawks would do, and that obviously would put more military pressure on Putin in terms of the success of his campaign. So the president's got plenty of leverage here for sure.
He feels even more. He feels more than ever that Putin wants to do a deal. So they're going to end up in Hungary, and possibly Zelenskyy could be there too. Maybe not in the same room, but the president's willing to go to great lengths in order to stop the killing. And I think the leverage of the Senate sanctions, along with the possible delivery of the Tomahawks, which can do everything you just said, is very much in Vladimir Putin's mind. So we'll have to see how that goes today. But, General, I have to go to Hamas and your sense on what they're doing now, trying to kill off their enemies, being slow walking a lot of the bodies. I found out yesterday that the Israelis told them where 10 bodies are located, you don't need special equipment. And now they got 48 hours to deliver them, and they're already overdue. But let's bring back the president's quote, and here's what he said. If Hamas continues to kill people in Gaza, which was not the deal, we will have no choice but to go in and kill them. Thank you for your attention to this matter. And it won't be us, it'll be the IDF and there's other Arab countries. Your thoughts about the president and the way Hamas has acted since the deal was signed?
Well, in the agreement, there is an acknowledgement that it would take some time to find these bodies. Hamas wasn't in control of all of the live hostages. The two other terrorist groups operating inside of Gaza, and they're not in charge of all of the deceased bodies either. But the Israelis have given them the intelligence they have received from Hamas fighters and also Palestinians who they detained and know where those bodies are. So that is assisting them. There are some issues with rubble. The Turks are probably going to provide a very large group that they use after earthquakes take place to help find bodies. So there are some logistical issues here. But I think the Israelis are right that there is some delay tactics going on here. Why is that? Well, because Hamas stays in control as long as this is going on. And they are telegraphed that they, one, are not going to disarm. What does that mean? That means that they're not going to give up control. They want those weapons to be able to maintain control over the population itself. So it looks like we're on a collision course here. Not for certain, but it seems to be heading towards that we're likely going to have to use force to disarm Hamas if they stay in the mindset they're currently in.
Keep your phone on, General. There's so many impactful things going on around the world, and we're going to always need your insight. General Jack Keane, thanks so much. Have a great weekend.
Hey, Sean Hannity here. Hey, click here to subscribe to Fox News YouTube page and catch our hottest interviews and most compelling analysis. You will not get it anywhere else.